Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and cats of all ages, welcome to a very special Cultured Nerd Meets Storytime Podcast. Hit it, Taylor!
Come on, come gather around. Come hear tales both lost and found. Grab yourself a drink with a splash of lime. It's David and Michael story time.
Hey everybody, and welcome to a brand new in-person video edition of Storytime. The one who's not David Miller, well, that's me, Michael Santel.
And the one that is most definitely not Michael Santel is me, David Miller.
What a special time that we get to have today. We get to launch two shows, bring them together in a way that's very different.
I feel woefully unprepared for everything we're doing right now, and I am loving being along for the ride.
Funny enough, if any technical problems have, there's nothing you can do. They're going to hear all of our flubs. They're going to hear your crazy cat. They're going to hear everything.
Yeah, I'm really excited to just be hands off on this one.
Well, I am excited, too, to bring on a very special guest. He's the owner of what we call the Cultured Nerd Podcast over here. He was my neighbor one block down who I would go to for all of my anime and Saturday morning needs, telling us a banger of a tale. David, what do you know about Star Wars?
I mean, everything there is to possibly know. You couldn't ever surprise me with something about Star Wars.
Well, get ready to get surprised as we hear the untold story of what George Lucas wanted to do with the next trilogy. And telling that wonderful tale, it's the wonderful, the beautiful Taylor Murphy.
And there he is.
Now, these two have met each other in the past. Here's a picture of them throwing
how long ago?
Hadokens at my wedding. That's them. You can see they have different techniques. David's a little bit more Street Fighter. Taylor's is a little bit more Dragon Ball Z, but both are applicable.
I mean, I love both of those things, but when I'm told to do a Hadoken, I'm gonna go Street Fighter.
Sure. Taylor, what tale do you have to tell us today?
So
disregard that he already said what tale.
Yeah, I mean, you already said it, but let's get into it. So today we're going to talk about what George Lucas had originally planned for his sequel trilogy while he was wrapping up the prequel trilogy. This was something that he had actually put pen to paper. He had got an outline, everything ready to go. And then from what he said in interviews, he quickly realized that he wanted to raise his daughter and didn't want to spend another 10 years of his life devoted to another trilogy. So he looked for a way to continue Star Wars essentially without him, which eventually led to him selling it to Disney. And then Disney took his plans, said those are cool, and then did their own thing.
And thank you, but no thank you.
Well, Taylor, on our podcast, we then do a thing called predictions of what do we think is going to be told inside of this story today.
Yeah.
So David, what are your predictions for George Lucas's version of what the next three Star Wars movies were?
I mean, I kind of, man, I'm so unprepared. I didn't even think about my predictions. So I'm obviously, I think it's going to center around the conflict between the Sith and the Jedi.
Okay.
I think, I would think, and I guess a resurgence of the Sith, but I don't.
Is Jar Jar Binks there?
No, I mean, I loved the. I don't know if either of you probably were that. The whole bit that went on a long time ago that is Jar Jar Binks is a secret Sith.
Yeah,
and all of that. I love that bit and that.
It's never been debunked.
I know. That's why I'm still a true believer. But no, I don't think Jar Jar Binks would have had a place. I think some of the droids probably still would have been around in some 3PO and R2D2. Maybe even some, Chewie or something. I don't know. I'm gonna take a wild left turn and say that it would have moved away from the whole Skywalker everything completely. Not to say that they none of them would have been in it, but that I don't think it would have centered around the Skywalker legacy, as it were.
Okay.
This would be my big swing.
My prediction.
Interesting prediction. I will start off saying you are dead wrong because the
Yeah, hell yeah,
I
I
have
am.
to predict. I
entire
know.
thing. The entire thing is about the prophecy of the chosen one and who the actual chosen one is.
Oh, so it wasn't Anakin / Luke.
And it
Oh,
wasn't Anakin
boy.
and it wasn't Luke. So
Okay,
let's get into
those are none of my guesses. My predictions are the following. I think there's going to be some sort of Ewok bounty hunter. There's going to be
Okay.
there's going to be some sort of weather conditioned planet we haven't seen yet, like Typhoon Planet, and they like ride surfers. They like do surf waves there.
It's a planet of acid rain.
Thank you. That's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I also feel like the new bad guy Jedi is also Sebulba and right. Okay, those are all of my things. All right, Taylor, let's get into it.
All right. So all of this information comes to us from this beautiful, heavy-ass book, the Star Wars Archives. This
It is
one,
a pretty book.
There's 2 of them. There's volumes 1 and 2. This one is episodes 1 through 3, 1999 to 2005. And
Taylor
for everyone who
could have chosen to save for his children's future or bought that book, so he is now saving for his children's future.
So I'm going to throw the link. If anyone does want to buy this thing, I'm going to throw it in the thing. It is on Amazon. This book itself is about $180.
Okay.
It is.
It's expensive. It's a good Christmas.
It's
present.
it's like a real nice coffee table
It's
conversation.
a giant coffee table. The thing is excess about 600 pages. So it's a big thing, and it's filled to the brim with set pictures, set building, concept art, storyboards, literally everything about the making of. And then in the margins of literally every single page is a series of interviews between the author of the book and George Lucas. So he's basically walking through every single page of what happened in this process.
That's really cool.
What is George Lucas's opinion? Like, what does he think about why we all hate the prequel trilogy? Does he also still think it's computer graphics and like if he were to do it when Avatar was coming out, it'd be way better?
I think he kind of says it a few times in here that he thought the prequel trilogy, some aspects of it went over everyone's heads and other aspects of it were too much for kids. And
I love taking the stance of you just didn't get it. I love that.
Because the political side of the story was very straightforward. There was a lot of symbolism, a lot of other details that people just didn't catch. Like he basically described that the Jedi Council had become the Pharisees and they had lost their way to the true religion and had become blind to what was actually happening. And he basically talks about how true evil doesn't just show up and take over. True evil is voted in. And that was the whole prequel trilogy, is that they willingly gave up their power and their freedoms thinking that they were doing the right thing. And in fact, they elected like Galactic Hitler.
The worst guy. Yeah.
We needed a Nazi Jedi. Like the Sith always looked evil and bad, but they weren't. Like we needed a person that's like, I follow all the rules all the time. So then when the switchover happens, they go, oh, I'm gonna kill you now because I follow the rules all the time.
I love that you said the sentence, we needed a Nazi Jedi.
Like a Werner von Braun, you know what I mean? Like he'll build our space program for us. We just got to bring him over to make the new Jedi Council.
So I'm going to just jump right into it. So back in, he basically wanted to kind of detail a little bit more, like why he chose the prequel trilogy first, because he had this all planned out and everything he wanted to do. He chose to go the prequel route because he felt that while he was making the original trilogy, the tragedy of Darth Vader was kind of lost on people. They didn't realize how tragic of a figure he was. He said it plainly in the book, there was no room for me to put backstory in any of these films in an organic way. I had started talking about the backstory, and he initially, so I'm going to segue here, when he initially planned this back in 1981, the concept of the midichlorians first came about, but they were also coupled with another concept called the wills. And these two things worked hand in hand. They were two symbiotic relationship entities that lived within the entire universe. The midichlorians were one, the wills were the other, and together they dictated the living force and life itself. When he saw how much people hated the concept of the midichlorians, he completely backed away from the concept of the wills that was going to be talked about later on.
So when you would get a certain feeling when the wills were working, you would have the willies. Like you would like will yourself and you'd be like, oh, I feel tickliness, and be like, oh, that's the willies. Okay.
I mean, honestly, I kind of like the idea and sort of wish that it would have still been in there.
Yeah, because he went into big detail of what these this concept was. Wills Wars. Let me grab it. I'm going to get some more details about it. He basically said the wills were microscopic, single-life cell forms who were essentially God. They were everywhere and they were nowhere. And through the midichlorians, they enacted all action in the universe.
So some people just had more God in them?
No, that was the midichlorians. The midichlorians was a concentration that allowed connection to the Force. The wills was essentially God / the Force.
So your high midichlorian count would mean that you could receive more will messages or guidance, and that's like it makes it make a little more sense, at least to me. How
do I summon lightning? Is that the wills giving me lightning? Like, how does the Sith use this equation?
Having access to that power, I assume.
He didn't go deep enough into it because people did not like the idea.
Okay.
So essentially, he said, in the most general sense, the midichlorians are the ones that communicate with the wills, and the wills, in the general sense, they are the Force. So the midichlorians allow you to connect to the Force, but the Force itself is the wills.
And individuals with higher midichlorians have the ability to interact more with this Force.
Yes. Essentially, the midichlorians is like, it's exactly what he said it was. The midichlorians were a microscopic being that allowed a deeper connection to the Force, and the more of it you had, the more of a connection you had. And that was just kind of straightforward.
Was there ever a tangent where you could like get more on the black market and be like,
inject yourself with midichlorians?
Yo, let me get some more midichlorians.
That could have probably been something
he kind of always said that the midichlorians itself were this biological aspect, but the more you would adhere toward the will of the Force, the more they would replicate within inside you. So
the training in the Force would allow you to train harder.
It was like the more you followed the dogma that was set about by the Jedi, the more that the midichlorians would replicate and engulf you and become. And that's why essentially when the Jedi would die, the midichlorians would engulf you and then dissipate you into the Force.
Love it.
Could it be argued then that we've never seen a true wielder of the Force because that council, like everyone has been bastardized in some way?
I'd say anyone who died and then disappeared, you could count as like a true wielder of the Force then, because that means they were fully subsumed into the Force when they died. So
So like Yoda, Obi-Wan, Luke, the people who turned themselves over completely to the Force, they were the ones who were the true Force users.
Yeah. I like if we have the concept of midichlorians, I like this whole idea because it kind of makes it a bigger thing and cool.
It makes it
ultimately more... I like the idea that the Force is just kind of this big unknowable force though too. Like, so I can see both sides, but I'm down for the wills.
So he talks about this, and the reason he went to the prequel route first, he said, let's see. I started talking about the backstory, the wills, the midichlorians, and that kind of stuff. And people, and if I would have done all of that in Star Wars, people would have gone, "Oh my god," and then completely backed off. So it wasn't until Jedi came out that I realized I lost the tragedy of Darth Vader. In Star Wars, I set it up as, "What is that guy? Is he a monster? Is he a robot?" And they didn't know who he was. Over 3 films, his story slowly dissipated. He was the chosen one of the prophecy. Yet the irony was that lost that was the son. It was the son bringing back the humanity of the father. That was no longer clear. I felt the story of Anakin Skywalker had enough pathos and enough of a story to enrich the prequels, how Anakin became a Jedi, how he learned to use the Force, the dark side of the Force, the light side of the Force, and the midichlorians. And there was Obi-Wan came from, the relationship, how Anakin turned into Darth Vader. When I told Fox the next film was about Darth Vader, how Darth Vader got to be Darth Vader, they were all excited. I told them in the first movie, he's 10 years old. And Fox and the people at Lucasfilm said, "You're going to destroy the franchise. You're going to destroy everything. You can't do it. It's terrible." Everybody was upset. And I thought, this is why I own the films, why I own the company. Because if I didn't, this film would never have gotten made.
I love that attitude.
Yeah. So he kind of goes on and then explains that that's why he went the prequels first, because he needed to explain this backstory. And then, as you go through this big-ass book, near the end of it, he talks about what he would have actually done going forward.
Mm-hmm.
And that was probably the most intriguing part. So he basically describes that the original trilogy was essentially this kind of like symbolic view of this was the Vietnam War, right? This is what the rebels, the overarching enemy, and what he wanted to do was that the sequel trilogy would have been inspired by the aftermath of the Iraq War. There would not have been a First Order style replacement for the Empire. Instead, he basically explored the challenges of reconstruction of everything, of the entire infrastructure of the Jedi, of the entire infrastructure of the Galactic Republic. And he says,
which also feels like him dipping his inkwell back into Frank Herbert and Dune and kind of the stuff, because once you see how much he took from the Bene Gesserit witches, you're like, oh, okay, you were really influenced by all this stuff. And then you see on this next level, like, oh, okay, you're gonna have a jihadist government going against old clans and like one Jedi. Okay.
Oh no. Oh, wait for it. It gets more complicated. So he basically said. So George basically said, okay, you fought the war, you killed everybody, now what are you going to do? Rebuilding afterwards is harder than starting a rebellion or fighting the war. When you win the war and you disband the opposing army, what do they do? The stormtroopers would essentially become like Saddam Hussein's Ba'athist fighters that joined ISIS and kept fighting. The stormtroopers refused to give up when the Republic win. And he basically starts going into what this power vacuum was. And the power vacuum was probably the most interesting part, because
this is why Star Wars failed. Nobody's thinking about power vacuums. I want to see space wizards. I want to see space elves.
This is a great idea, and I would have loved it.
But this is why this is important. The power vacuum was then filled by none other than Darth Maul.
Right.
Darth Maul obviously came back from the Clone Wars. And the idea was that during the Clone Wars, during the sequel, the initial trilogy, he had built up a underground, essentially the Crimson Dawn or whatever they initially called him. Now, the idea was always there was a power vacuum, so gangsters like the Hutts are taking advantage of the situation. There is chaos, and the key person is Darth Maul, who had been resurrected in the Clone Wars cartoons. He brings all of these gangs together. By this point, Maul is very old, so we have two versions of him. One of with a cybernetic set of legs like a spider, which he used in the show. And later on, he has metal legs that he built, and it was more like he was now bigger. He was more like a superhero, is what he kind of described it. So essentially, what they did with the Clone Wars is that he still wanted to do the Spider Maul, and then eventually replacing his legs and becoming more of a human Maul. Okay. He then said, going forward in the sequel trilogy, Darth Maul would have had a new apprentice, and that apprentice would have been the main protagonist, essentially, of this. The main antagonist, essentially, of this thing. She would be the Darth Vader of this trilogy. And that villain was Darth Talon. She was a Twi'lek who had basically completely followed him every step of the way. He basically describes Talon as the new Darth Vader. And even though she was not a character that he created, he loved the concept, he loved the idea, and he adapted her completely.
And you said that she sparkles in the sun. You said she's a Twilight?
Oh my god!
No, she's the weird.
Oh, okay. I was like, man,
he knew exactly what you meant.
Bringing everything into
this. So going forward, he did talk about how this is the part he says. After the Rebels won, there would be no more stormtroopers in my version of the third trilogy. I had planned for the first trilogy to be about the father, the second trilogy to be about the son. And the third trilogy would have been about
the Holy Ghost.
Holy Ghost. It's the Holy Ghost.
The daughter and the grandchildren. That's it. So episodes 7, 8, and 9 would take ideas of what had happened after the Iraq War and everything I just said. Let me jump forward a little bit. They want to be stormtroopers forever. So they go to the far corner of the galaxy. They start their own country, and they've created now their own rebellion. The power vacuum of the he said, and I read about that bit. So now we jump a little further ahead. Darth Maul would now have trained a girl, Darth Talon, who was in the comics was his apprentice. She would be the new Darth Vader, and most of the action was with her. So there were these two main villains of the trilogy, Maul, who eventually become the godfather of crime in the universe. After the Empire falls, he takes over. And now these movies are about Leia. Who else is going to be the leader? Who is going to be trying to rebuild the Republic? They still have the apparatus of the Republic, sort of, but they now have to get it under control from the gangsters, and that is the main story. The first part, episode 7, would start out a few years after Return of the Jedi, and we established pretty quickly that there's this underworld. There are these offshoot stormtroopers who started their own planets, and now Luke is trying to restart the Jedi. He puts the word out, so out of the initial 100,000 Jedi, there's about 50 or 100 left total in the universe. The Jedi have to grow again from scratch, so Luke has to find 2 3-year-olds, and then he has to start training them. It'll be 20 years before you see this new generation of Jedi. And we were going to see in the first episode that part, the initial start, where he was going to go look for the Jedi. He was going to explain what the Jedi initially had done. And it was going to delve into the backstory of how the Jedi initially found their recruits. So this would have been a very different viewing of, so we saw what it was like when a Force user became a Jedi without knowing the teachings. And then we saw the Jedi in their heyday. And now we were seeing that same Jedi who was blind by pretty much all the teachings, learn the teachings, and then go about the old way and then changing it to his new way. And so that was his story.
And that means like showing up to places that have never thought about this before and being like, oh, your kids have the Force. And they're like, oh, we call that manana. And there are like, right. He'd have to convince people to like take their kids away.
Exactly. He would have to then explain, this is what this is. This is the connection. This is what the midichlorians are. This is what the wills is. This is how they fit into the universe. And this is the responsibility that they have by being born this way as a wielder of the Force. Their job is to be the peacekeeper of the universe. Their job is to bridge the gap between God and man, essentially. And
it's their destiny, if you would.
Yeah. And he would have to explain all of this to them and recruit. And that would have been a lot of his stuff. And then they go on to it saying, by the end of the trilogy, Luke would have rebuilt much of the Jedi, and we would have had a renewal of the New Republic with Leia, Senator Organa becoming the Supreme Chancellor in charge of everything. So in a sense, Leia became the chosen one. She was the one to fix the universe after the fall of the Jedi.
And the one literally chosen, like elected.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And also, but that was super heavily implied in Return of the Jedi. That like, don't worry, nope, there's another one. Because they're like, Luke is going to die. And they're like, no. There's still one more out there for us.
Yeah.
Ironically, though, when he first wrote that line in Empire Strikes Back, it wasn't about Leia. He wanted to introduce another Jedi, and then he backtracked and made it about Leia. So, fun fact. So he said, going forward, this was about hope and faith. So the midichlorians started the birth process in Anakin's mother. The wills communicated the command to the midichlorians, which activated the DNA that germinated the egg. That's why Anakin doesn't have a father. He was, in a bizarre and metaphorical way, touched by God. But in this case, that's what happened to be these one-celled organisms called the wills. He then actually goes into saying that initially the plan was that the Force would have been perverted and manipulated by Sidious, by Palpatine, and he was the one who triggered the birth of Anakin. So the Force would have done it anyways, but Palpatine wanted to puppeteer it for his gains, and he was actually going to.
Nobody gave his mom frankincense and myrrh, so like, how did they know it was the right one? You have to give gifts for babies.
So let me jump into it. They talk about let's see, fatherhood. Qui-Gon is going to become a father. Anakin. Okay, he talks a little bit about father figures and clones, and then goes into all of that. But essentially, as this story would go on, he would. We know a few other details throughout the massive. He drops these details almost like a few details per page in the most archaic possible way. So people have had to go through and pull it all together.
Which also speaks about like his mind, right? Like George Lucas didn't write any of this stuff down. He just has like a jumble of memories and ideas in his head. And he kind of, sometimes they come out.
Sometimes, but he did write a kind of an idea of what he wanted to do. He kind of planned out, like he does rough outlines of everything. So he had a rough outline of the prequels and the sequels back in 81 before he filmed Jedi. So he knew what he was going to, and he was knowing what he was wanting to do. And the idea was that this trilogy, the time period was actually going to be pretty pretty dramatic. So the first episode would have been just a few years after Return of the Jedi. Episode 7 would be right after that. And he knew that going into it, the idea was that set 5 years later. But because when did Return of the Jedi come out? Right? The end of the 80s. And he was done with this project in 2005. So he was probably looking at how am I going to de-age my people for the least amount of time. So he was actually looking into that idea. It was let's de-age them. Let's figure out the pioneering with makeup. And he was going to go right off the bat with the fall of the Empire, the New Republic starting, the politics with Leia, her relationship with Han, the birth of the kids, the twins from the expanded universe were going to be kind of retooled into the chosen ones going forward. But they were going to be part of Luke's class people.
Do both the babies have powers? Both the babies have midichlorians and wills?
Yes, they were both. Their relation to the Skywalker bloodline was really unknown how strong it was, but you know that they were both essentially Jedi. He did actually have names for them in the Star Wars Legends of the Expanded Universe. We knew that the kids were Jason, Jaina, and Anakin Solo, but in the trilogy that he had planned, he wanted 2 kids, and they were going to be Kira and Sam, and that was the initial plan. So
not for nothing,
forward,
but I've always loved the name Kira. It's just a side note.
That's a great. I didn't know that about.
It's a good name.
It's a great name. It's a good name.
So we know Darth Maul was the villain. We know Darth Talon was his Darth Vader, and coincidentally, that kind of made it so that the main protagonist of this trilogy would have been Leia, and the main antagonist would have also been another female character, Darth Talon. It would have been a very interesting way to see how fans would have received that, given the last 2 trilogies were not that at all.
Would Leia had trained with a lightsaber? Would we see her fighting like that?
The concept wasn't really lost on them. They did want to go about with Leia she was a military leader. She was essentially a general in her own sense. They knew of her, but she also asserted that she was connected to the Force. And the idea that she would have been trained and then stepped away from that training was still prevalent. She obviously, the calling of a Jedi is one path in life, and she chose the path to use politics and order to try to fix the universe instead of becoming a peacekeeper like a Jedi.
But there'd be that one scene where she and pulls out this little box and opens it up and pulls out her lightsaber, right?
Yeah, and it's be like, or Darth Talon is attacking her, and then she whips it out and be like, "Not today, bitch!" And
attacking her, and then in the last moment, she force calls it, like Mjolnir over and blocks a thing.
I love. So we set it up that it's like a part of an art installation on the wall, and we see it every movie. She looks at it, she's like, "Those were adventures for another day." In the third one,
path,
and the third one, she rips it off the wall, and you're like, "What? The art display? It was a lightsaber." Also, Darth Talon should get beat up in every movie. So in the first movie, she loses half her face, and the ending credits, we see her red eye turn on like the Terminator. And then in the next movie, she loses an arm and a leg, and then she comes back even stronger.
Well, at least one of them is one of her arms or hands has to get cut off, because that's just a staple throughout the entire.
That's a Star Wars staple. Yeah,
that's a Star Wars staple.
So one major plot point that they wanted to go into was they were going to actually go into the wreckage of the Death Star, and they were going to dig through it. They were going to essentially, they wanted to investigate, and there was actually a big portion of the Death Star underwater. So there was supposed to be a whole sequence where now they're underwater, essentially scuba diving through the wreckage, looking for details.
Cool.
The idea was that they were trying to gather all of the information that the Emperor had stockpiled, all of the archives, all of the details, and essentially use that as a basis to rebuild the libraries. Because, essentially, like you said, Space Hitler cut off knowledge from a lot of people, and he kept it stored, so they needed to get it back.
He might also have had genealogies or something, so you could go find those new recruits for the Jedis you're looking for and stuff like that.
Well, because we know that when the Jedi Temple was being raided, they talked about how that one of the things that they did before they abandoned it was wipe those records. They wanted to make sure that no one could be found. So it was never clear that if they found it via the Jedi text or if Palpatine had them and was watching them. It was never really clear, but they did.
Also, they don't know what he has. He's an old man. It's probably World War II documentaries. Like, what else does Palpatine have like documents of?
Well, he'd been so closely enmeshed with like the Jedi Order and all that stuff that like maybe he had somehow gotten copies of all of those records before they managed to wipe them, you know.
He knew about all the trade smuggling that was going on during Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
So we do know that at the end of the last episode, episode 9, Luke was still going to die. That was always the plan, was to have Luke die, but they wanted to make sure, and the exact quote was, I happen to know that George didn't plan on killing Luke until the end of episode 9, but it was made very known it was after he had trained Leia. So the idea was that, but this trilogy was also meant to not span over a couple years at a time. The first episode was 5 years after Jedi. The second episode would then jump maybe 10, 15 years. Third episode would jump another 10 years after that. The idea was that the last episode would have been caught up with the present ages of the actors so that it wouldn't be as complicated, but it also allowed them the opportunity of introducing the twins as children, as babies, children, teenagers. Now the franchise can move forward with these young adults.
Yeah.
Also, Luke has to go back to the Force. He's gonna Ben Kenobi himself. You know what I mean? Like he understands the highest level of what Jedis do. That's exactly what he would have done.
And the thing that I've always loved, so we probably would have seen maybe a somewhat similar like kind of arc for him, but like the thing that I love that ended up happening in the existing sequel trilogy is that he does end up like all of like the quote unquote like greatest Jedi that we've seen, which is eventually going, screw this, and going into hermitude, and then showing back up to like train the next generation or like fix this one problem. Right. Yoda did it, Obi-Wan did it, and then he did it, you know.
What is Han up to?
So we know that Han does father the kids. He is still present. He does have his ties to the gangster world, so he did provide some insight. He had some connection to these people. But in a sense, he was also supposed to die very quickly on. He was supposed to be one of the first sacrificial lambs of this trilogy, just like he was in the current sequel trilogy. And George had always planned this.
George Lucas knew that he couldn't get him for more than one movie. That's
because Harrison Ford was actually pretty smart in the sense that he never signed a trilogy contract. He signed a single film contract a time. Every single time that they said, "Hey, you come back for the next one," he's like, "Yeah."
Baller.
And he waited for them to like, "Oh, maybe they'll kill me off. Maybe they'll do this." And he kept putting it like, "Hey, you have to give me an out just in case I don't come back." So going into Carbonite, maybe I'm not going to come back. He always had planned this. We know that he was going to die at some point. But we do know that Luke and his Jedi Academy were a major plot point, and the kids of Solo were major focal points.
Yeah,
I always wish the movies kind of dug into the Jedi Academy a little bit more. I always loved that idea, and I know there's like other like extended universe and video games and stuff that dig into it, but yeah.
It's the best part. It's the fact that they haven't done it. It's like Harry Potter. It's like
like being from a like I grew up as a kid with Star Wars perspective. Like the idea that it's like what a school for Jedi like is just the coolest thing that a kid could think to be a part of, right? Like I love
the hubris of our young selves that we believe we'd be special enough.
Oh, I'd be chosen. The Metachlorians
I'd be chosen.
Swarming in here. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we also know that there was another Force-sensitive character that Luke would have found, and it would not have been related to the family. It would have been someone kind of the age of the kids. It would have, but it would have been just kind of essentially a character like Rey, but from the ground up would have been discovered, trained, and focal to the journey, but not tied to the past character. It wouldn't have been like some descendant of Palpatine, some descendant of Kenobi. It wouldn't have been anything like that. Just another character that the Force had been living through. So we know that he said in various versions of the treatments, one version had her name Taryn, one had Thea. They eventually, it just kept changing. But it was very unclear of what her overall role would have been. But we know that she was a primary character. Maybe in a sense, kind of like the just a supporting character for the other characters.
I like it. I like the idea that this entire galaxy-spanning war doesn't, like every facet of it doesn't boil down to one family. Like, you know.
She
So,
would steal from Luke in like the marketplace, and he'd be like, "Wait, that's my thing I need, kid." And he would chase after her, and she would like force up a wall or something. And he's like, "Oh shit, I gotta follow this kid." And then we like see him like going after her, and she's like, "How did you find my secret house?" He's like, "I have my ways." And the people outside are just like other kids who's like mind controlled. Can you mind control children? Yeah, that's allowed.
They probably have the weakest minds.
The weakest of minds.
So, unfortunately, there's not a lot of details that he had made completely known. We know those details, but that is essentially it. We know that he had this idea that the overarching story would have involved Luke building the new Jedi Order, dying near the end of it. We would have known that the underworld will have been crushed, the new Republic would have been birthed, and there would have been true peace in the galaxy after it was all unified. But aside from that, we don't know who the final person was to defeat Talon. We know that Luke was probably victim to either Talon or Maul himself. I'm assuming it was Maul, because he mentioned a few times that Maul wanted to get revenge on Kenobi. Kenobi's dead, so what's the next best thing is go after Kenobi's pupil.
Sure. Yeah.
So we know those details, but we know that by the end of it, the only last man standing was Leia, and she was the one who had been crowned Supreme Chancellor. She would have been the one that unified the galaxy following the death of her husband, following the death of her brother.
But it makes sense.
The last living Skywalker.
It makes sense. She wasn't in the shit. You know what I mean? She wasn't there. Also, Chewbacca lives. Whatever that final scene of her getting crowned, Chewbacca is right there.
And he yells just like in the first one.
For sure.
Yeah, it'd be cool if like it kind of like split, so it was like Leia is like the Supreme Chancellor and like kind of ushers in this whole unity like politically, and then new unrelated Jedi, Tara or whoever, like takes over for Luke at the school, and then it's like we have both
that was actually the plan. That once Luke had died, there would have been a successor named.
Take on the mantle of yeah.
Do both the kids survive? Do we lose one of the kids?
Or do we get the little like one of them starts to fall to the dark side, and then there's this pull between the two, and
that was never made clear. We knew that they were part of it, and there was going to be a big story told between them. And the idea was that he based the twins off of the initial characters from the expanded universe, and one of them did fall. So it would have made sense that one of the twins would have teetered into the dark side, but then been pulled back.
Probably, yeah.
So a lot of the things that he does cite, a lot of these details do kind of teeter into what we know of with The Force Awakens, with Last Jedi. Like we see a lot of these ideas somewhat being rehashed, but
the underworld idea feels exactly like what happened in the Boba Fett show, and a little bit of what happened in the other Fett show as well.
Mandalorian. What we do know is that Jon Favreau and Dave Filoni loved these ideas, these pitches, and a lot of fans have been believing that they're actually quietly adapting these details into their canon, because we know that the sequel trilogy takes place, like 25 years later? And this trilogy would have actually taken that 25 years. So essentially this trilogy can still exist within the canon with some changes.
And you replace, right. So Rey now becomes Luke. Maybe Finn becomes the new Chancellor guy, like the political guy.
No,
it's not Poe.
Finn was actually going to become a Jedi as well. That was actually the plan. Was he was Force sensitive.
Still think they should have. They should have done that. But
they technically did. They just never went for it completely.
Didn't finalize.
They teased it a lot. But he says that in an interview that he had with James Cameron, he talked about this trilogy and these plans and said, "If I had held on to the company, I could have done it, and then it would have been done. But of course, a lot of fans would have honestly hated it, just like they did Phantom Menace and everything else. But at least the whole story from beginning to end would have been told." And that was, I think, to him, it was possibly one of his regrets that he never got to finish his story. But he also did say multiple times that going forward, he would have lost more of his social life, his life with his relationship with his kids. He dedicated 10 years at a time to each one of these trilogies.
Right.
And
which
he
is,
needed to
when you're
pass it
raising a
off.
kid, their entire childhood. So,
So he did pass it on. And I mean, George Lucas has pretty much stated that Dave Filoni is his greatest protege. And Filoni loves these stories and moves forward with as many of these details and Easter eggs as he possibly can.
I mean, there are a lot of cool nuggets for like cool ideas in there,
Yeah.
I dig
And
it.
Filoni is teasing and adding and putting these little treats in for everybody on a constant basis. I mean, with the Bad Batch, you have teases to Shadows of the Empire. With the more recent Tales of the Jedi, he did add in a plethora of details within just those 6 mini episodes. I mean, it was I think 90 minutes total to watch that whole season. And each one of those episodes, we understood that during episode 1, Count Dooku was still a Jedi, but he was fallen and working under Sidious. We knew it was made very clear, and then he was also the one who killed Yaddle. So we knew that. And we knew that Qui-Gon's death was actually the final tipping point for him to fully say, I'm done. I'm a Sith now. I'm done with this crap.
Yeah.
So we got a lot of these things that George had wanted to do and wanted to talk about, and now they're being kind of recanonized in a way.
Yeah.
I love it's so interesting because initial Star Wars is what it is. Changed the world. We then get his next movies and we hated it, but they were still his. And he then gave it up, and we basically hate those movies. Now, there are things I like about those movies. There are things I really like about Force Awakens. There's great imagery in all these movies and really fun Star Wars stuff.
And I'll give you my hot take, like that makes, a lot of people either really agree with or really disagree with, but The Last Jedi is one of my favorite Star Wars movies of all of them.
Right.
So, like we got good stuff, but yeah, I agree. Like it would have been really interesting to see the same person's like ultimate plan for
But Taylor already said it. They were so tepid about everything. They didn't want to commit to anything. So it's all these just like half choices all the time. And then, the hottest of the mess, the Rise of Skywalker, that's like 15 storylines.
I think that's why I like
The
Last Jedi so much, especially in comparison to the other two, is it actually feels like it's making bold choices, right?
Yeah.
And then if they feel like they backtrack them.
Well, you already had 7. I mean, how many movies at this point, right? You already had a bunch of movies about Star. That was the first movie that's like, let's talk about the wars part and that people are being affected by this. But funny enough, that is the jumping off point for all of the Disney Plus stuff of like, war is really difficult. Look at these small people in the forest. Like that is now the moving forward point. So it's like,
it makes sense then that also like Rogue One is another one of my favorites because that also has those same themes of like, those ideals are nice, but when war hits the fan, like,
right.
Yeah.
And that was what he was trying to do with his sequel trilogy. I mean, you obviously like he had his original trilogy, which was about the war, the rebellion, the action. And then the big dialogue portion, like with the prequel trilogy, the main dialogue was the building of the empire. Like that was the big plot point going forward. This one was dealing with the aftermath of essentially destroying the universe's economy, destroying the universe's structure. And obviously the power vacuum coming from organized crime and these like terrorist cells that were building up, these factions of ex-stormtroopers that were building up these little like war economies and these little like all of the stuff that he wanted to get into. And he's obviously, that's why he said they probably would have hated it because it's not what they were expecting. But Disney chose to play it safe. They chose to do The Force Awakens, which was essentially the safest sequel they could have made.
100%.
I mean, the big thing everyone made fun of it for was it just felt like New Hope again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they moved forward with the Last Jedi. And I like The Last Jedi. I don't love some of the choices that they made. I would have changed a handful of things. Like my big gripe to me was honestly kind of the flagrant disregard to the children and the caring more about the horses than the children. Like, come on, Rose, what's your deal? I was really irked by her character. And I think it was just because how Ryan Johnson wrote her as this pacifist who was somehow fighting a war, which made zero sense. Like, if you're a pacifist, don't go into war. Like, you can't. Like, it was insane. And then her whole like, we don't win wars by killing our enemies. No, that's exactly how you win wars, Rose. That's exactly how you do it.
I really like Rose, but I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Like, my issue with her was that it felt like he was trying to do too much politicking with that character in a franchise that didn't need that voice, in a sense.
Well,
like
we sacrificed a whole Poe story. Like, we sacrificed like one of our established characters doing something and feeling more, because then the next movie they got rid of her and tried to shove in a bunch of adventures real quick.
Yeah.
And that was the other issues, because you had episode 7, then you had episode 8, and then you had episode 9, which was essentially episode 8.1 through episode 10. Like, they were trying to we need to fix this, and we need to retcon. And we know that there was a completely different trilogy ending that they had with the original episode 9.
What do you mean? How do we know this information?
Because the script leaked online. It was initially called Star Wars Duel of the Fates. It was actually written by Colin Trevorrow, the guy who brought us Jurassic World. And
so there's a big gift shop in the beginning of the movie, and then they play the Star Wars theme.
So I can actually, since we have a little bit of time, we're at 45 minutes. We normally go for an hour, so 15 minutes.
Okay.
Let me just jump right into reading what the original episode 9 would have been.
Sure.
Because essentially Kathleen Kennedy had kind of a warring opinion of what she was doing with the sequels. One hand, you had J.J. Abrams, who had his firm plan, and then she had decided, maybe let's not go that route. Let's go with this plan. And then when that failed, she's like, no, let's go back to JJ's plan. And then she commissioned JJ to not only finish the trilogy, but wrap up every story and loose end at the same time. And I honestly think that if she would have just said, this is fine, let's just move forward with this episode 9, it probably wouldn't have been as much closure for a lot of the details, but it also would have been more akin to what we had with The Last Jedi.
It would have felt more focused, probably, instead of this kind of hodgepodge of everything.
And we don't want them to answer things. I want them to make more movies. So maybe leave some stuff open. Yeah. So like the next movie, I'm like, oh, all those questions I had, let's get into it.
All right. So at the end of episode 8, we saw that the First Order has won. The rebels are now down to maybe 25 people. That's about it. Several years later, after the events of The Last Jedi, the First Order now rules the galaxy with General Hux as its chancellor. Taking control of Coruscant, the First Order delivers daily public executions for members of the Crushed Resistance. And there was concept art that showed actually a lightsaber-like guillotine in the square, and they were just taking people down. Right?
That's like awesome. That's some brutal stuff.
And they have now blocked communication across the galaxy.
Ooh.
Still free from the First Order's control, Rey, Finn, Poe, Rose, and BB-8 steal a Star Dreadnought from an occupied planet and blah, blah, blah.
That's their triangle ships? Those are the...
they steal one of the Dreadnoughts.
Yeah. The bigger than Star Destroyers.
Yeah.
Okay.
They steal the Dreadnought, and they take it to Coralive, where the surviving members of the Resistance, led by General Leia Organa, are establishing a new base. On Mustafar, Supreme Leader Kylo Ren discovers a Sith holocron in Darth Vader's castle, which he made his home. Darth Vader's castle is now his, which leads him to seek the training of a 7,000-year-old alien by the name of Tor Valum, later revealed to be one of the initial masters who instructed Emperor Palpatine's master, Darth Plagueis. So he actually tracks down Darth Plagueis' master.
You mean Darth Plagueis the Wise? That Darth Plagueis?
Darth Plagueis the Wise, the one who was killed in his sleep by Emperor Palpatine. He wasn't wise enough to see his apprentice from murdering him.
To be fair, though, I can't see anything in my sleep, so don't get mad at that guy, okay?
You can't really blame him for that.
He had his eyes closed.
During his training, Kylo battles a Phantom of Vader and is taught to absorb the life force, but Tor Valum is killed by Kylo using this technique. So after he is taught how to basically siphon life from people, he turns on Tor Valum and takes him out, making him the supreme.
Which honestly, Tor Valum should have seen that coming.
You don't teach somebody the ultimate a technique and then not have them use it.
That would have been the thing
Exactly.
everyone dunked on, which is like, how dumb is this guy? Like,
So, meanwhile, Rey is learning from the sacred Jedi texts that a device is capable of fixing communications that has been stored in the Jedi Temple on Coruscant. There's
This is all good. I just want to. How fucking cool would the Darth Vader fight against Kylo Ren be?
yeah,
there was
he would-
there was actually some
No, tell
concept
me.
art about it, which was pretty rad.
Because he would do all of his Vader things, and then Kylo would be like, "Yeah, I know about all that stuff."
I've
and
seen
then
that. I read
yeah,
all up about that.
and then he
yeah.
would just murder Darth Vader.
And then he would like cut
but-
Darth Vader's head off, and then it would roll, and then the mask would explode, but it would be Luke's face again for some
It's
reason.
Luke's face again.
So there was actually it was actually kind of teased that this Phantom that he was fighting wasn't Vader. It was actually a manipulation of the Force from the Sith, because Vader had redeemed himself, but the darkness that he had set away from himself was still being embodied by the living Force.
Cool.
Oh.
Like a fucking like ghost, like just the pure badness of Darth Vader, like
Yeah.
made flesh is
That
really
believe
hate
it's been
still
re-
lived on.
Yeah.
Shadow Mega Man, Shadow Link, whichever Shadow villain you want, you got to watch out.
During
Negascott,
this whole
yeah.
process, though, we also know that Luke Skywalker would repeatedly torment Kylo. So there was some concept art of Kylo screaming and swinging a saber, and then Luke's Force was like grabbing it and taunting him. Cool
That's
stuff.
so great.
Cool.
I'm already dead, Kylo. What are you gonna do?
All right. All right. Here we go. Meanwhile, Rey learns. She learns that there's a way to fix the communications and restore communication throughout the whole universe, and it's actually based in the base of the Jedi Temple. The Jedi Temple sat on this machine. So they travel to Coruscant. The team split up. Finn, Rose, R2-D2, C-3PO, trying to restore the communicators using the device, while Rey, Chewbacca, and Poe depart on a mission to Bonadan to find the planet of Mortis, the location of a vision Rey had with her dueling Kylo. So she realizes, I have to confront him, and it's on this planet called Mortis.
If the robots are there, we missed intercom bits of
Yeah.
go the elevator. The what? Oh
Yeah.
no! Like we forgot all that stuff.
So on Coruscant, Finn and Rose are captured. Actually, no. They activate the device, which would allow Leia to send a message through the galaxy to inspire the rebellion. But they are attacked by the First Order before completing it. Rose is captured, and Finn fights a stormtrooper with the serial number RK514. And this is they apparently had some backstory about who these stormtroopers were and why that one in specific was significant to him.
Sure.
Finn himself, being a redeemed stormtrooper, ultimately spares his life after defeating him, and RK514 convinces other stormtroopers to now defect and help Finn's cause.
Cool.
With the help of the droids, ordinary citizens, and now a legion of defected stormtroopers, Finn leads a revolution on the streets of Coruscant, with Poe, Chewbacca, and an army of resistance now arriving to assist the battle against the remaining First Order forces. Having been convinced by Leia, Lando arrives with an army of smugglers to aid in this revolution. When he learns that the First Order is nearing defeat, Hux kills himself using a purple-bladed lightsaber that he has in his collection. It was actually revealed at this point that Hux was actually he idolized the Jedi when he was
that
younger.
Mace Windu's lightsaber?
It was kind of implied, yeah. So he actually, instead of destroying all the memorabilia of the Jedi, he was collecting it for his own private archives. And when he was backed into a corner, he pulls a Hitler and kills himself. So that was that symbolism there.
I was thinking how cool it was going to be seeing stormtroopers with Rebel Alliance stuff all over them, like coming down the street and you see them attacking. That's pretty dope.
Yeah. And like Finn at the head of a column of like defected. Yeah.
Let me show you.
He should put on what's her name's gold armor.
It was not gold. It was like shiny silver.
Yeah, he should put that outfit on. Remember when they
so she actually
wasted
comes
that
back.
character? Of course she
came back in
does.
this one too.
Great.
She was the one leading the public executions, apparently.
Yeah.
So as this story went, after being tortured, Rose managed to free herself and rewires the hyperdrive of the First Order's base above Coruscant, causing it to crash. After defeating Kylo's subordinates, the Knights of Ren. So they're actually going to be another plot point here, and they were going to be used, but Rey was going to be the one to defeat them. Rey battles Kylo on Mortis, who blinds and defeats her. So Rey's now blind, almost killing her with this new power to absorb the living from the life from the Force. Luke Skywalker's Force spirit offers moral support to Rey, and she confronts Kylo for a second time. Rey states that her masters were wrong in rejecting the dark side and embracing both sides of the Force. She essentially becomes the Grey Jedi.
Which was supposed to happen. They talked about that.
Yeah.
That was the whole point of The Last Jedi when we saw how far she went there and was like, oh, it's there if I want to touch it.
Yep. The dark and the light coexisting in a true balance. Doing this, giving her the upper hand and allowing her to defeat Kylo. However, Kylo dies redeemed, healing Rey with the Force after Leia calls out to him. His last words to Rey, reveal Rey's true birth name and to be Rey Solana. So he finally tells her who she actually is.
But
On the verge of
Solana
death-
is just a person. It's just a person in the
Yeah,
galaxy.
but he
Great.
gives her closure by saying, "This is who you really are."
Great.
On the verge of death, Rey meets with the spirits of Luke, Yoda, and Obi-Wan Kenobi, who allow her to choose between staying dead or returning back to life, either becoming one with the Force or returning to the living world.
Sure.
And then that's where that kind of leaves you hanging there. So then it jumps back at the Resistance base. Finn, Poe, Rose, Chewbacca are given medals for their heroism. Sometime later, Finn and Rose settle on the planet of Modesta, where they create a home for Force-sensitive children. So they essentially, Finn being Force-sensitive himself, he
My
creates kind
name
of like
is
a boarding
Ray.
school.
I've created a special school for gifted children.
Instead
this
of being
was
in a
actually-
wheelchair, she's blind.
This was
yeah.
Finn. This was Finn actually doing this, because at this point we don't know if Rey survived or not.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So he builds this X-Men mansion of Force-sensitive kids.
Love it.
A silhouette soon approaches to the homestead, revealing herself to be Rey, who vows to train these children with the Force while showing how the balance of the light and the dark will maintain peace throughout the galaxy.
Nice.
So that was the
the
initial
end?
plan. That was the end.
With a bow.
She was
there.
going to basically say, I have to train them, but I'm going to train them a new way. We're going to train them the path of the gray. And then that was the moving forward.
They should have blinded Rey. She should be
No,
blind.
they did. She was blind.
Is she still blind?
In the movie that happened?
No, I mean, in this she didn't
In
get her
this
eyes
version,
healed.
she got blinded.
She stayed blind after the fight, but she
I know.
used the
her.
Force
I'm
to-
saying they should have blinded her in that movie as well.
Like
I think
the
that's-
existing one that they really made.
Yes, they
Yeah.
should have had her eyes fall out and her be like, "Nope, I've never been more."
No, that should have been the scene, not just that she gets struck in the face and like they fall out.
Whatever the reason is, okay? I don't know. She gets hit by lightning,
I
doesn't
don't know how
she?
space works.
If she her eyeballs fried out of her head, but she still was
Sure.
alive, I think
Sure.
it'd be cool.
No, I get you.
But
It's just
with
funny
the,
to think of them falling out.
The concept art actually did come about. Duel of the Fates. Let me grab some of it. There was actually plenty that actually made its way online, and it was actually pretty rad. From what we understand from this concept art, Rey had a double-bladed lightsaber. That was her final weapon.
Cool. We all love that. Ever since we saw it with Maul, we all went nuts about it.
Yeah, and there's no
let
reason
me-
why a good person can't use a double-sided lightsaber. They're not like more of a murderer now. They can still have the same amount of will.
They could be more of a murderer.
Yeah, it's easier
They
to
could be-
kill.
They could be up to 2 times as much of a murderer.
Yeah, you kill one too.
yeah.
Let me throw it on the screen real fast just so you guys can see.
Yeah.
This was the like. Let me jump it. There.
Yeah, cool. See,
Yeah.
right? That's cool looking.
That's great looking.
That's great.
There's so
and
much
he
of it here.
and he is basically wearing what I wanted. I wanted him to have like battle armor on. He's wearing battle armor.
Yeah, they're just the rebel version of the stormtrooper armor, but without the helmets.
So here is the bit that where she's dying essentially, and she kind of wills herself into the Force. Rey lays on a stone slab, still injured. Light fills up the space around her, particles of energy floating up, and she rises with the energy. The light engulfs her the frame until we reach a plane beyond what we know. This new astral plane. Luke, Yoda, and Obi-Wan appear before her, and Rey questions, "Is this death?" To which Obi-Wan replies, "In this place, there is no such thing as death." Yoda reveals to Rey that she succeeded where they had failed. Now Luke speaks to her, "You have chosen to embrace the dark side and light, to find that balance within." They then offer her the choice to stay in the comfort of the astral plane or return to the living where she will still experience love, loss, and eventually death. The spirits fade, and Obi-Wan says, "You are now a Jedi, Rey Solana. You will not be the last." And the scene goes black.
That's the same room that Dumbledore and Harry Potter were in, and they had that real creepy Voldemort under the bench.
Right? So
I love that they set her up to find love. Now, I know it doesn't need to be romantic love, but they were like, "Oh, you're going to have more human experiences." And that's great, because the one thing the Jedi were always so closed off of, it's like, "Oh, can't do any of that stuff."
Yep. Let me throw this one last bit on here, because this was the concept for the final sequence. And obviously they just kind of threw in the this was supposed to be the Jedi homestead, and there was 2 pieces of concept art that came up. I'll just throw the second one, because the first one, one of the shots was a close-up of BB-8, and you could see Rey's silhouette coming in the eye, and that would have been a really pretty cool shot. But she would be walking up to the homestead, and that would have been how the movie would have essentially ended. The last 5 minutes were her walking up and declaring that she was now going to teach these Force-sensitive youth the way of the true Force.
Yeah.
So
Professor
essentially,
Ray's
she's
school
still
for
a Mary
gifted
Sue in a
youngsters.
way, but she is much more focused.
Well, it's funny. We're now at this spot where we didn't get that. I wonder if we're going to get what George Lucas wanted, and Rey has to scour the galaxy as a one-man band to put people back together again.
Well, it's unclear, but what we do know is that, like I said, Favreau and Filoni are kind of weeding some of George's plans into their concepts. We now have the Star Wars Acolyte show coming out, which is going to be the end of the High Republic. And then we have Ahsoka show, which is going to be setting up kind of a spiritual sequel series to Star Wars Rebels. There's been some rumors that have already made its way online that following Ahsoka's show, Ezra Bridger is going to be getting his continuation show where he's going to be a member of the Jedi and kind of like crossing paths with Luke in that path. And then we now also know that they are working on more Star Wars films following Episode 9, and Rey and all them may come back, and we may see more of that from there.
Yeah,
so
cool.
Took them long enough, but they're finally kind of fixing their own mistakes by not doing what they should have done the first time.
Right. Rad.
Well, that's a lot to process, but I've learned many lessons. David, let's go to lessons.
Okay.
Now, I wrote down as many as I could, but
I wrote down one because I was just deciding to be into it. So I wrote one lesson, and it was kind of from earlier on in the whole story. Do you want mine first?
Well, let me tell you mine. You put yours in appropriately. First, I learned you have to have a big coffee table. You just have to have a big coffee table for all your big coffee table needs. Taylor, how big is your family coffee table?
I actually don't have a coffee table.
You deserve a coffee table, my good sir.
Someone get this guy a coffee table.
She wants to get one. She's like, "Hey, we should just get one for the living room." And I'm like, "Well, our kid may hurt himself on it, but he's getting older, so maybe not."
Okay.
I learned from this story that Werner von Braun was a Nazi. Listen, he made those rockets, but he had an origin story.
You learned that because you brought him up.
It's a lesson I learned this week, David. It's a lesson I learned. I wrote, where there's a will, there's a way. And that's just something you should all take away from what we learned today.
Now, where there's a will, there's probably
a metachlorian.
Yeah, that's very true, too. I learned today, own the company. If you don't like the corporate rules, go in there and buy it. Whether it be Star Wars or Twitter, just
I was
go
about to say,
it.
that's a great lesson across the board, no notes.
Yeah.
I'm going to put my lesson in here now.
Great.
This is a real lesson.
A real one.
A real one. You either die a rebel or live long enough to see yourself become the Empire.
Yeah. Very full circle.
That was the whole thing.
See, that's closer to my lesson, because my lesson was always come back from death. if you are given the option to come back from death and tell us what was going on over there.
What if you're just tired?
Great question. I wrote the third. I learned that the third is always the Holy Ghost. Whatever it is, it's the Holy Ghost that's hiding. I wrote, you got to give gifts to babies. They can't afford to purchase into this economy. You got to get them presents or they're not going to be able to get cool shit.
I disagree. Babies don't need presents. They don't know what to do with it.
I wrote, David loves Akira. That's a solid statement.
Sure.
Because you love the name Kira.
Yes, I do.
So you love the name Akira. That's what I said.
Sure. Yeah, it's a good name.
I wrote.
He does this every time in our podcast.
Yeah, I believe it.
I wrote, don't have a wife and kids. If you have goals in your life and you want to focus on them like a Jedi, you can't have a wife and a kid.
I almost said that about halfway through when we were talking about how he stepped away to like be with his family instead of finishing his trilogy. Yeah.
I think just like in Star Wars, when you take a test, don't answer all the questions. You only need a 70 to pass. Leave some of them open for interpretation. Just leave them open. You don't need to answer all the questions at the end of a movie or a test.
I personally like in the short answer section of every test to draw a picture. So the teacher is like, is this an answer or is this just them presenting me with art?
That's up to their interpretation. Yeah.
Exactly. I learned this week that if I'm sleeping, it's not my fault. I will not be held accountable for what happens while I am sleeping.
I feel like we've had that actual same lesson on our podcast, like our regular podcast.
Totally. I think so. Another lesson that's come up on our podcast many times is watch out for shadow warriors. The Jinn will get you. They are demons that live in caves and they will get you. You got to watch out for them.
I promise you, we have never said that lesson on our show.
I'm pretty sure we talked about the Jinn before, David.
We've talked about the Jinn, but you've not. Oh, whatever.
I learned the lesson that you need to be open to love. Don't be like a stingy Jedi, okay? You got to be open to live open in your heart with love. And then I learned that you got to fix your mistakes. That was the last thing Taylor said. I agree with him. Once you make a mistake, you got to fix it here and now. That way it doesn't linger on.
Heck yeah. Boom. Lessons.
Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us here on your own podcast with Reinvaded. Where can people go for our audience if they want to follow you and all of your things? What do you do? Where can they go and find you?
So everyone who does follow, everyone who's on this channel currently watching us live, obviously that's where you can see us next week and everywhere else. You can also find me on all the socials. At The Cultured Nerd on every platform is me. So
Taylor is telling you all the news of that is breaking at every moment of what is happening with 3 different companies. And just FYI, it's probably up-to-date news.
Try to be.
But
no, I saw some comments in here where people were upset that we were talking about Star Wars today and not DC, because a lot of DC stuff happened over the last few days. And I decided I want to wait to talk about that because it's happening at such a fast rate that I think we need to give it a little bit more time to get more.
By the time you talk about it, it's obsolete. Yeah.
Also, spoilers. Exactly. We just talked with DC. Like, they're going to get a DC episode very soon. We talked a bunch of DC stuff, but that's a spoiler. No spoilers.
Yeah. By the end of this week, everyone, we will have another episode for you specifically about a DC topic. And then in that video, we talk a lot about the current event stuff.
Yeah.
About it.
Yeah. So go give a look for all of that. Well, Taylor, thank you so much for joining us. David, thank you for joining us. Look at us recording. We never recorded this time.
Yeah, I know, right? It's like actually after work for me.
Yeah, there's no work emails coming through for you now. Well, the one wearing a big star in his shirt, well, that's David Miller.
Yeah, and the one who looks like a cozy, like casual lumberjack, well, that's Michael Santel.
So cozy, so casual.
If it helps, Michael, I'm in my pajamas, and there are.
As well. You're 2 halves of the same lumberjack.
I wish I would have known you were wearing comfy pants. I would have put on my comfy pants. I just have regular brown pants on.
Hey, Michael Santel, where can people who are watching this live right now find our regular podcast?
You could go find us over at Storytime, at Storytime Podcast.
The Storytime Pod. I'm so proud of you. It's at the Storytime Pod is like the Twitter.
Yeah, that's where you can find it there. We never post there. And you can go find us on anywhere that there are podcasts playing. You can go find us Storytime.
The podcast is called Storytime. Yep, there you go.
Yeah, go listen to all of those tales. Funny enough, we brought up Star Wars things. We talk about Star Wars things as well.
Sometimes.
Very little though.
Sometimes.
Well, thank you
right
so
now
much.
we're going through all of Animorphs, so that's a whole.
Yep.
That's a
We're
whole thing.
we're pretty deep into Animorphs. I'm also pretty deep into Changeling and Elves right now. They usually pop up in my stories a lot. So more of that coming to you very soon. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see all you kids and cats next time. Okay, bye.
Okay, bye.